Welcome to This Week in South Carolina. I'm Gavin Jackson. This week, we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. I'm joined by co-author of the book, A Century of Women's Votes, Christina Wolbrecht, who's a University of Notre Dame professor. And we also look at the latest news coming out of South Carolina this week. South Carolina is on track to see its 5th week of declining COVID-19 cases and its 4th week of declining deaths, as the number of patients in intensive care beds and on ventilators also continues to drop. Testing percent positive rates remain high, and the number of people getting tested has fallen. Folks continue to adapt to the pandemic, and that extended to how political conventions are taking place this year as well. The Democratic National Convention went virtual and incorporated hundreds of speakers throughout the country, including several here in South Carolina.
But more important than his firsthand experience with loss and hardship is his ability to translate that perspective into policy and solutions, and prioritize hard-working people and persistent poverty counties over partisan politics or personal gain. That's why I stand with Joe, and why he will always be an adopted son of South Carolina. Joe Biden is as good a man as he is a leader. I have said before and wish to reiterate tonight, we know Joe, but more importantly, Joe knows us.
Senate Democratic candidate Jamie Harrison also participated in the roll call vote with fellow Democrats from around the country.
Tonight, I proudly cast South Carolina's 64 votes as follows: 15 for Bernie Sanders and 49 for our next president of the United States, Joe Biden.
Next week, Republicans will hold their convention, originally set to take place in Charlotte. There will be live NewsHour coverage on SC ETV channels starting at 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. Congressman Jim Clyburn also addressed concerns over cost-cutting measures implemented by the U.S. Postal Service, which many see as a threat to the financially strained agency ahead of the expected record-setting mail-in voting this November.
I feel very strongly that this issue is something much more than whether or not people are able to mail in ballots. Defunding the post office is something far more sinister than that.
Senate President Harvey Peeler this week called for senators to return to Columbia on September 2nd to consider legislation dealing with safeguarding the November election, likely along the lines of what we saw for the primaries with no excuse absentee voting, among other things. Join me now to discuss back-to-school plans and all things education is State Superintendent of Education, Molly Spearman. Superintendent, welcome back.
Thank you, Gavin. Great to be with you.
So let's start off by talking about school safety. We're seeing some schools getting ready to go back, some in person, some online, some a hybrid of both. I want you to tell me, specifically with these teachers going back and these students going back in some of these situations, what kind of assurances, what kind of words do you have for folks who are maybe worried about this whole process, be it teachers, staff, or students?
Well, first of all, you cannot guarantee 100% safety, but we're trying our darndest to do that. The schools have worked very closely with us at the Department of Education. We've been in contact daily with DHEC. We're working with a nonprofit that's affiliated with MUSC called Back to Business, and they're altering their plans slightly. Instead of just back to business with commercial business, going and helping us with schools to ensure that they're doing everything possible. We've ordered, with the help of the governor's office and the CARES Act funding, PPE, and I've visited a number of schools that have the luxury of having folks on staff that are experts in logistics. I was down in Charleston County to see what all they have done with plexiglass and their signage and equipment, and they have shared that information with other districts. So we're doing the best we can to make it as close to 100% safe as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you were just touring the state the other week, giving out that PPE too. Do you feel like we have enough, we are ready, teachers are feeling comfortable?
Well, we should be ready. We're in the process and have already delivered masks. We ordered at the Department of Education, we ordered 5 cloth masks for every teacher, every custodian, cafeteria worker, bus driver. Those should be there waiting for those folks when they return to school. Additional masks were ordered for students on school buses. Some districts are supplying masks, but we're asking families to help us out too, to send their student out the door with a mask on if at all possible. We've ordered the gowns, the gloves for nurses and other folks who need that type of protection. And then we have the plexiglass that is actually dividing class tables so that students who are sitting at the same table will have an extra protection. So it should be ready. There's some of that equipment is in very high demand. So we're helping districts if they have not received their orders to let us know, and we'll make sure that they have what they need to get school open.
Superintendent, can you kind of give me an overview about what kind of district plans we saw approved by your office? We have about 80-some school districts across the state. All the plans were approved. Some are going 5 day a week in person, some online, some hybrid. Tell me what you wanted to see out of these plans, and maybe some generalizations about what's going into place right now.
Well, the first thing we looked for was the expectation for the students' engagement. This is very different than the emergency learning that we did in March. We were kind of on survival mode then and did the best we could, but there's been time for a lot of planning, a lot of progress made to be able to deliver either virtual or in-person instruction even stronger. So the expectation that every student will be engaged, attendance will be taken every day to see how they're going to deliver that. But it's been quite a learning experience, Gavin, and I've had to adjust my expectations too, because this virus has affected different communities in different ways, some more intense than others, and I've learned that I have to be sensitive to that. So that's why you see the difference in the plans, where some are going back 5 days a week. They've had enough children to say that, and families to choose virtual so that they can get their class size down and feel safe in offering a face-to-face model. And then others don't have enough, they're doing the hybrid. And then some, there's just not enough students going virtual to allow, or either staff folks who'll say that they feel safe coming back. So it's been a lot to learn and to adjust, but I feel comfortable. We are asking all districts, particularly those that have gone all virtual, to evaluate every 2 weeks and to change their model as they go along. So we're going to be monitoring that, because the goal is to get students back in the classroom, and really at 5 days a week if at all possible. So we're going to work very closely. So those families who are virtual now know that we're going to be watching the numbers and really encouraging those districts to change their model and move toward face-to-face and get those students in if it is safe and can be done safely.
So again, like you were saying, one of the things you want to see done, it's gonna be a little bit more stringent. It's gonna be a little bit more school-like than what we saw at the tail end of last school year. Is it going to be tougher, do you think, for parents to kind of keep up with this if they're doing all virtual, or do you think it's going to be harder for this to get done, or do you think maybe we're in a better place right now? People kind of know the routine. How do you see this affecting everyone?
Well, we should be in a much better place. Number one, we're in a better place with access to the internet. We can talk about that, but we're delivering hotspots. Over 80,000 are being delivered as we speak to make sure that families do have internet connection. There's been a lot of training for teachers to be able to teach virtually more successfully. How do you engage with the students? We've even trained parents on the devices and how they can help. So everyone should be in a much better place than they were. So the expectation is higher, and we will, as I said, be taking attendance. Students must turn in their work. They must check in every day. And we have purchased a learning management system licensure, over 650,000 licensures for teachers and families in the state, where students can connect, receive their their homework assignments, turn those in. So we're in a much better place to manage all of this and to keep account of what's going on.
You're talking about accountability and keeping in touch. One of the big issues we saw at the tail end of last school year was a lot of missing students, some thousands of them. Can you give us an update about that, where we maybe stand right now, and how, again, you're gonna counteract that this year and make sure that all the students are accounted for?
Well, I think that was the difference, that we were unable to do a daily attendance count with students. So those numbers are down to, we turned in about 3,200 names. We're working very closely with the Department of Social Services. They are now in the process of contacting families for those that we absolutely could not reach. So I feel much better. And I think as students are now coming back to register for the new school year, we'll be able to make those final contacts. And knowing that some of those families have moved out of South Carolina, so we'll have a better understanding of all those numbers shortly. All districts should be started by September 8th, so we should really have a very good count on that.
And that'll be something you guys really keep on top of.
Absolutely.
I know that's been a big issue for lawmakers too, but Superintendent, when we look at some of these plans that have been approved, and this is all being implemented at the local level, there's the oversight from the Department of Education. At what point do you feel like the Department of Education would need to intervene in a school district when it comes to implementing these plans? Maybe, for example, something's happening with five-day week instruction face-to-face, teachers aren't feeling comfortable, they're voicing their opinions, but maybe aren't feeling heard. They reach out to your office. What could happen if we see some needed oversight here for these plans?
Well, we have established several different protocols for not only teachers but parents, if they're concerned, to call us at the Department of Education, speak with our ombudsman. We will then contact the superintendent in the school, and that even includes things like, we don't think they're carrying out the protocols for protective equipment or whatever it might be, but working very, very closely with those local districts. I hope that we don't have to intervene with any type of financial withholding funds. That is within our realm at a very small percentage, and I don't want to go there because that's certainly very strict, and I don't want to overreact, but I am working daily with superintendents and with local school boards to ensure that we are putting into action all the plans that we've said we're going to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I know you were recently on I think a Zoom call with some teachers down the Lowcountry, and they were talking about how about 45% of them said that they would breach their contracts if school districts didn't go all virtual, if there was high spread in a school district. Is that concerning to you?
Well, those numbers were fairly high, and it wasn't a statistical type poll. There were several, I think 2,000 or 3,000 teachers, and several hundred of them answered the poll. We'll see. As we are going back, districts seem to be working very closely on a case-by-case basis with their teachers. Obviously, if they have medical conditions or family members or whatever, a strong reason that they can't come back, the districts need and must work with them, and that's what we're asking them to do. But it is a district level, case-by-case negotiation with those teachers. Most of them have been placed to teach virtually, and in maybe a few circumstances they are asking them to come into the building. But again, we're open to hear concerns, and we'll do our best to help negotiate that, because those teachers do need to be protected. But as I said to those teachers on the call, more than ever, we realize how essential teachers are. And I know everyone has fears. I have fears. I don't like to go into public meetings either. But in my job, I do have to step out on faith a bit. And so we need them, and I'm encouraging them to come back to work and help us build a very safe environment.
Superintendent of Education Molly Spearman, we have a minute left. I want to ask you a little bit about how political education has really gotten. I mean, I know it's always very political. You get down to the school district level. I've been to those meetings. But were you surprised to see just how political it did get this summer when we came to discussing how schools are going to reopen? We had the governor go out and say that he wanted to see 5-day-a-week education instruction face-to-face. You weren't at that press conference. You guys spoke before it. He even had the vice president down here backing up his plan. Were you surprised that it became so political, and did any of that influence your decision going forward in approving any of these plans?
Well, it didn't change my decision for sure, and I guess I wasn't surprised because at a national level it became obvious that there was pressure for all schools to open. And I understand that because we do need to get back to school. The kids need to be there, parents need us to help them be able to go to work. So it is a tough, but it's a very complex issue, and you cannot answer it with every school's got to open 5 days a week. You cannot do that. So I stuck to my guns. And got some praise, got some criticism, but it did not change how I reacted because my job is to make sure and serve the people of South Carolina in the best interests of public education. That's what I was elected to do as a state constitutional officer. So yes, it has gotten a little political, but I'm still trying to make the right decision based on all the data that I have.
And I'd be remiss if we didn't bring up broadband expansion really quickly. You mentioned it about the hotspots. What else are we seeing taking place right now when it comes to expanding broadband to those communities in our state that don't have access to it?
It's a great coordinated effort now between the Department of Education, the Office of Regulatory Staff, the telephone providers, the internet providers, everyone working together to make this happen. We have surveyed and realized that we need at least some 80,000 hotspots. Plus, we're paying for families who may have internet access, but they can't afford it. So we're paying for that, but that goes through the end of December. So I'm going to be working with the General Assembly to see how we can sustain that assistance for families. So we've made a lot of progress over the summer.
Gotcha. Great to hear. And again, thank you for all your work. I know it's been a very long summer leading up to this point, several months of hard work. We're going to see where it goes. State Superintendent of Education, Molly Spearman, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, ETV. Appreciate all that you do, Gavin. Good work.
Thanks. Christina Wolbrecht is a political science professor and director at the Rooney Center for the Study of American Democracy at the University of Notre Dame. She's also the co-author of A Century of Votes for Women. Professor Wolbrecht, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
I know you've had a busy week so far, so we really appreciate you getting in touch with us to talk about this great book. And this book that you co-wrote with Professor Kevin Corder, it's about the turnout and the vote choice of American women in presidential elections from the ratification of the 19th Amendment up until the 2016 election. So really informative, really great in-depth look at all that. But I want you to maybe chart the evolution for us of presidential candidates from the beginning, when they recognized this new constituency of women, up into where we are now with women helping, shape the direction they want to see the country go and the policies that matter to them.
So the first book that Corder and I wrote together was actually just about the presidential elections right after suffrage, so 20 through 36. And one of the things that really struck us in doing this research, and one of the reasons we wrote the new book, was there's so much consistency. So when William Harding is running as the Republican candidate in 1920, he's talking about education. He's talking about equal pay. He's talking about maternity health benefits, right? A lot of topics that have certainly evolved, but 100 years later are very close to the same sorts of topics that candidates use over and over again when they try to appeal to women voters. And certainly when they're trying to appeal to women as women, the focus is on really two sort of broad areas. One is, and frankly less so, is sort of women's rights themselves. So certainly Harding did the same. We're hearing the same from candidates today who, again, talk about things like equal pay that they think that are really close issues to women's hearts. They also often, quite consistently, really see women in their traditional roles. And so a lot of appeals to women really assume that they're mothers and talk very directly about that idea. So women should care about education. They should care about health care for their children. Even their concern about, say, foreign policy is shaped, the assumption goes, in terms of not wanting their sons and husbands to go off to war. And we hear that in the Second Gulf War, in the beginning of this millennium, and we heard this, in the Korean War, and throughout.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely, so a lot of the issues still stay the same, even though the approach and what they mean to women have changed. Yeah,
and I think one of the things that sort of signals to us is that while so much has changed, this is probably the most expansive and remarkable 100-year period for women in terms of their lives, economy, their role in work, their role in the family, dramatic changes in the 20th and 21st century, but that politicians and the press still, when they're asked to think about women voters, fall back on those more traditional roles. Things like, again, equal pay. Now, it doesn't mean these things change over time, right? So last night, Elizabeth Warren, for example, talking about childcare, right? The presumption that many women do work outside the home, but still the assumption is that that sort of parenting role is really central to women's political interests.
And then, Professor, I want to talk about, when we look at the right to vote, specifically for women in the South, again, it was ratified in 1920. Some states made exceptions for women to be able to vote in that election in 1920. South Carolina, one of the states in the South that did not let women vote in that election, just one of many ways the vote was still suppressed. And then we look at the vote for women of color, specifically black women. They were not part of this movement in 1920. They weren't part of voting essentially until 1965. Can you just touch briefly about just how the evolution of the black vote for women has changed? I mean, starting from the beginning, when you see these suffragists actively using black women as a way so they could get the right to vote and pushing them down so they could make a case against them.
Yeah, the story there is complicated and really important, so I'm really glad that you asked that question. It's important to emphasize what the 19th Amendment does and doesn't do. The Constitution actually says very little about voting, and what the 19th Amendment says, or at least it did originally, is that you cannot discriminate in voting rights on the basis of sex. It's literally the same language as the 15th Amendment that says you cannot discriminate in voting rights on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But the 19th Amendment, by saying you can't discriminate on the basis of sex, did literally nothing to push back against exactly what you said, the sort of long traditions of voter suppression and barriers to black people voting in the South during this period. The truth is, voting regulations and voting administration happens at the state levels. And even in 1920, as you mentioned, the states really varied in how much they wanted to accommodate women. So some states held special registration days and expanded hours in the evening and all this information to help women learn how to vote. Just, what do you do when you get into the polling place? Other states, as you mentioned, this was a period in which many had very long registration deadlines. So you had to register 6 months in advance. There were 4 southern states that said, oh, well, it's the end of August when this thing got ratified, and you guys didn't register to vote back then, and so we're sorry you can't vote in November 1920. You'll have to wait for the next election.
Mm-hmm. And so how have black women become more of a powerhouse when it comes to voting? Women in general, obviously white women, I think in your book you point out that they vote at greater numbers, but black women are not far behind that. What's the state of play in that regard when we look at both white and black women?
So first I want to make sure to acknowledge that even before 1965, there were some black women in the South who were able to overcome these barriers. So I want to acknowledge the barriers were huge, but also give credit to those women. Since 1965 and the Voting Rights Act, we've seen the percentage of African Americans in general and black women specifically in turnout accelerate dramatically. And as you said, the only group that turns out at a higher rate than black women now is white women, and those differences are really small. And this is actually quite remarkable to see a group that's faced these barriers now turning out at such very high levels.
Mm-hmm. It kind of gives the state of play right now. You've outlined the book from the beginning to when we see 1970, which was the 50-year anniversary, things really started changing, to the gender gap in 1980. Where are we right now in terms of issues facing women and the role that they play in presidential elections specifically?
So one of the things that I think makes women voters even more important today than they've been in the past is how very close our elections are. And so you can have turnout differences and you can have even vote choice differences, but if 60% of women vote for party X and 70% of men vote for party X, that's a gender gap, but they're still on the same side. But now our elections, time after time, we've seen this, right? The electoral college vote coming out different than the popular vote. Boy, our elections are very narrowly decided now, and women's high turnout and the fact that there's just more women in the eligible electorate because we live so long makes them a really key demographic, a really diverse demographic, right? So we have to recognize that women vote in lots of different ways, but a really important one.
And Professor Wolbrecht, we have just a minute left, and there's so much to talk about. Again, there's so much great information in your book. I found it very fascinating reading it. But I want to ask you right now, I'd be remiss if I didn't, just what you think about a woman of color, Senator Kamala Harris, being on the ticket now of a major party. What do you think might happen, how this might shape this election when we see women turning out to vote?
You know, the 19th Amendment is fundamentally about whether or not women are direct, independent political actors. And so Kamala Harris as the nominee is just another example of how far we've come in those sorts of ways. The depressing political science downer news I'm going to give you is that vice presidential choices don't usually change a lot of votes. Mm-hmm. Although I think in this case, the package of the two and the message that that's sending may well be a very powerful mobilizer for voters who are deciding whether to even get off their couches and go vote on Election Day.
Gotcha. Well, Christina Wolbrecht, thank you very much. She's a political science professor and director at the Rooney Center for the Study of American Democracy at the University of Notre Dame and co-author of A Century of Votes for Women. Thank you.
Thank you.
And join us Sunday at 7 p.m. for Sisterhood. South Carolina Suffragists Moving Forward. It's a special look at the movement from the beginning up till modern day. You can find that again 7 p.m. Sunday on SCETV channels. And also check out the South Carolina Lead podcast to stay up to date with COVID-19 news throughout the week. You can find it wherever you find podcasts and South Carolina Public Radio. For South Carolina ETV, I'm Gavin Jackson. Be well, South Carolina.